Welcome. Surprisingly few people realize that astonishing miracles occurred in Juarez at the dump in 1972. These miracles launched an outpouring of the love of Christ in many practical ways. Our guest, Father Bill Francis, is well acquainted with the story and its aftermath. Welcome, Father Bill.
Nice to be here. Thank you, Holly.
Well, you know, I was talking with a group of young adults a few months ago, and they had never heard of the incredible miracles which occurred in the dump at Juarez, or ever heard of the book Miracle of El Paso. And so I thought it would be good to recount the amazing story. And you are very familiar with it, and you knew Father Thomas personally. Can you give us a brief overview, and then we'll go to a clip of Father Thomas himself talking about it?
Yeah, you know, if there's one thing I love to do, and that's to talk about Father Thomas. He was quite an amazing man, a man of the Lord, a man who feared God rather than, he didn't fear man. And the result of that was that God did some incredible things through his ministry. And yes, it was back in 1972 that he had come to El Paso. He had replaced the priest by the name of Father Rom, who had been here for many years and done a wonderful job. He replaced him and became the director of Our Lady's Youth Center. And he formed a community of believers, and they were in prayer one day about if the Lord had something special for them to do on Christmas Day. And they felt like God was saying that they were to go to Juarez and find the poorest people that they could find and share Christmas dinner with them. And the poorest that they could think of were those that lived on the Juarez dump. And so that's
the beginning.
That's the beginning.
Right. Well, let's go to this clip and hear from Father Thomas and some of those who were actually there at the event.
As a member of a prayer community in Juarez that had been started by Father Rick Thomas, he all of a sudden read to us a chapter from Luke, which he said, when you give a supper or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your relatives who can pay you back, but invite those that have nothing to give. And at that very moment, Father said, I have never complied with this. And with that I identified. I hadn't either.
So we decided to come to the garbage dump for Christmas dinner and share with the people. Most in the group had never heard of the dump or been there. But we figured there'd be 125 people at the dump, and we prepared 125 burritos, some oranges and some apples. Somebody brought 2 hams, and we had a few tamales. And we went out on Christmas morning to see what would happen.
This is a group of Roman Catholics in El Paso?
Some from El Paso, some from Juarez. There were 2 prayer groups.
It was a very cold, drizzly Christmas morning, and we got up here at the dump, and there were people working at it. It just surprised me. Some of these people
doing what they're doing today.
Doing what they're doing today, just working around here. Some of them didn't even know it was Christmas. It was a shock.
What are they looking for as they scavenge through this? This is the way they earn their...
This is the way they earn their living. They work with a hole-like tool. It's got 1 or 2 prongs at the end of it, and they'll sift through the garbage. They'll separate the cans and the bottles. They'll separate cardboard, paper. They'll separate food, and they'll get it all in one pile, and then they'll sell it to the co-op. And the co-op will get it all up and sell it all collectively to outside businesses.
So in fact, these people are earning their livelihood by picking this material out of the garbage and selling it.
This is their work.
This is their work, and this is their livelihood.
6, 7 days a week they work here.
Well, we got out there and found that the dump was divided into 2 areas. 2 labor unions had it divided, and one group could not go in the other group's area, and that group could not go in this area.
So there's Father Thomas and Guillermina Villalba going back and forth between the 2 unions, kind of negotiating peace.
While we were trying to negotiate between the 2 groups, Dr. Villalba told us not to get them together because there wasn't enough food. There was a lot more people than we had thought we had, but anyway, we neglected to follow his advice and got the two groups together and found there was about 350 people, and we'd brought food for 125. So one labor union stood on one side of the tables, the other labor union stood on the other side of the tables, not having any contact with each other. We said a little prayer and said, now we don't have enough food for everybody, but we'll share with you what we got.
And from there, the people formed a line. They passed through the line, and we were giving everybody what we had. And at the end, we had a lot of food left over because we had more than enough.
That is an amazing story. And was this miracle which occurred a one-time event, or was it something that happened over and over again, and did other miracles occur?
It happened a number of times over the next few years after that. And someone who I know personally who had the experience of seeing the Lord multiply food was a lady by the name of Barbara Fry. And she's the wife of an Episcopal bishop by the name of Bill Fry, former dean of Trinity Episcopal School for Ministry, where I attended a number of years ago. And she and Bill were out at the food bank over in Juarez, and it was her responsibility to serve the tortillas to many hundreds of people that had gathered there. And she said that the pile was about this high, and so she began to serve, and the pile went down all the way halfway, but there it stopped. But the people continued on, and she continued to serve the tortillas, and that pile never went past the halfway mark.
Well,
and now Barbara, I know Barbara, and she's one who, you know, would never exaggerate or say something that wasn't true. She's about as straight-laced as they come. Right. Loves the Lord, and so she had the experience of seeing this incredible miracle. But you know, it wasn't the miracle so much that changed their lives and changed their ministry. When Father Thomas and his group went out there on Christmas Day, yes, they witnessed an amazing miracle, an obvious multiplication of their food,
Just like the story of the loaves and the fishes being multiplied, and many others in the Bible, exact same type of miracle.
Like that, yeah. Just like that. But the thing that really changed them was the sense of the presence of God through Jesus Christ, who was out there fully identifying with these suffering people who literally made their living off of the dump. And it was that sense of his presence with the poor that really began to affect them and to change their ministry in very positive ways.
You use the word fully identifying with the poor. These were middle-class people who were going over and helping, and if you had seen the whole video, which you can actually go on YouTube and watch the whole thing, which runs about 30 minutes, it shows middle-class people going over there and the difficulty of being there in the stench and the filth of this situation. So what do you mean by fully identifying? How do you do that?
Well, you know, in Matthew 25, Jesus said, "When you have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me. When you have visited the prisoner, you have visited me. When you have prayed for the sick, you have prayed for me." Mm-hmm. And this is the marvelous thing about the God that we know and serve, and that is that he is not remote, but he has chosen to become involved in his creation, to fully identify with his people. Whether they know him or not, he still loves them, and he is there with them. And it takes the catalyst that it takes to help them come alive to the reality of Jesus Christ. People like Father Thomas and his group who then brought the gospel to these folks. Yes, they fed them, they helped them in their physical lives and in their community, but more than that, they brought the eternal gospel into their lives, and that's what really changed
transformed
them.
Things. Yeah.
And that was their motivation. Mm-hmm. And from there, the Lord's Ranch began to develop.
Right. Well, there were actually a number of practical ministries which grew out of of this seed of the Christmas Day miracle. Isn't that correct? So you referred to the Lord's Ranch. What was the Lord's Ranch, and what are some of the other things that grew out of that?
Well, after they began to get this tremendous burden to help the poor, they sought the Lord as to what they were to do next, and they felt like they were to establish a farm, a ranch, if you will, and so they began to look for land. And they ran across some land that the government owned at the Anthony Gap area over by Vado. And about 600 acres. And the government at that time was leasing that property. And so they drew up a lease, and at the bottom of the lease there was this clause in small print: option to buy after 1 year. Well, the government just doesn't, once the government gets its hands on property, it doesn't sell its property.
Pretty interesting.
It keeps it. But here there was this option to buy after 1 year, and that's what they did. And it was dirt cheap, so to speak. They got it for a good price. And then they began to ask the Lord, okay, here we've got this 600 acres of desert. It's way far north of the river. Lord, what do you want us to do? Now here's the astounding thing, that how they were open to the direction of the Lord. They felt like the Lord was saying, plant apple trees. Well, I grew up here in El Paso, and apple trees just don't grow very well in El Paso, especially if there's no water.
Yeah.
So they bought 1,000 apple trees. They planted each one of them, and then for the next year, they watered those apple trees by hand. They had a big water truck. They had no well out there, so they got a big water truck, and they would take it down to the Rio Grande, fill it up, and then bring it back, and they would take care of those apple trees, watering them regularly, consistently during that year's period of time. Well, after 1 year, they didn't lose, out of the 1,000 trees that they planted, they didn't lose one, not one.
That's amazing.
Now the professional apple tree growers, if you will, they say that you're doing well if you lose 10 or 15%. They didn't lose one. But that was the blessing of the Lord on their hearts and on their ministry as they reached out to the poor in the name of Jesus. God just poured out his blessings upon them, and continued to do miraculous things like preserving each one of those apple trees.
Now, the purpose of the Lord's Ranch then was to grow food.
Grow food for the poor.
For the poor, and then also as a place of rest, and where many ministry groups actually came and worked and served, and it became kind of a landing station, if you will, I guess, for ministry over in Juarez. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct. I think that they would say that really the most of the food that they would acquire to take over to the poor in Juarez was, through donations and buying food at a cheap price over here. But they had the Lord's Ranch there that also, it helped. And, but more than that, it, like you said, it provided a place for people to come together and to pray and to grow closer to the Lord and to one another, and to be involved in something which was very worthwhile in terms of their ministry and outreach to the poor.
What was the impact in Juarez? There were a number of things that occurred. The dump community there was very much, there were, as I understand it, two factions, kind of two unions that were fighting against each other, and people lived in very impoverished conditions, and a lot of those changed. Things changed as a result of these miracles. Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, they developed a community over there, and it actually wasn't on the dump itself. They continued to minister to the people on the dump, but it was a very poor area of Juarez. It was close to the dump. And what they did was that they gathered lots of people in that area that were open to the heart of the Lord, and they all came together as a community. And what they did was that everyone was required to work in terms of community improvement projects. They would improve the dirt roads, or would help somebody with their house, or whatever it might be. And even the elderly people who were not able to work physically, during the time that the others were working, well, they had a place for the elderly people to meet and to pray. Oh. to pray that God would just pour out his blessings and draw people close to themselves. So everyone participated in the development of this Christ-centered community. And they had a food bank there, and they had gardens. In fact, when we came out here with Youth with a Mission back in 1981, one of the things that we did was that we helped them to plant organic gardens at the food bank and drip irrigation and that sort of thing. And so the result of all of that, again, was that this Christ-centered community began to develop, and from there were outreaches that began to take place to the prison and to the various institutions over in Juarez, the mental retardation places.
So those who had been served and reached out to began serving and reaching out to others in the Juarez area. And a lot of people likened this community to what the original Book of Acts type of Christian community would have looked like, where they worked together and they helped one another and they had cooperatives and that kind of thing. And that sort of thing is still going on over there, those ministries and outreaches.
Continues on.
40 years later, which is an amazing thing.
Isn't that wonderful?
What was the impact in El Paso? You would think that so many people say, gee, you know, the Bible's wonderful, but if I could see that kind of miracle or hear about that kind of miracle happening today, boy, there would be a whole bunch of new believers who would come to Christ. What was the impact of this? Did the word get out in El Paso, or did it have much of an effect on the bringing people to Christ?
Well, certainly the word got out. You could hardly, help, that from happening. But as far as what you would think to be a major impact on El Paso, maybe not as much as what it did in other places around the country as well as around the world. Because, Father Thomas, in France, for instance, he became well known in France and became known as the male Mother Teresa. And certainly there were a lot of churches, especially Catholic churches, and some Protestant churches. Our church, St. Clement's, we were greatly affected by it. And in fact, the chairman of Father Thomas's board is Ricky Fuel, who has been a lifelong member of our church, and he began to serve on the board there right shortly after the time of this great miracle that took place, and he continues to serve today after 40 years.
Wow.
So it was impacted us, and we invited Father Thomas. This was before I was ministering at St. Clement's. I was with Youth with a Mission at the time, but we as a church, invited him to come and do an evangelism seminar at our church.
And he was very effective at that. Now, you did know Father Thomas personally.
I did.
And can you tell us how you met him?
Well, I met him back in the late 1970s, and that's when I was with Youth with a Mission, and we were planning on having a major outreach down in Mexico City. And that was during the time that we had a number of our schools, discipleship training schools, located in various parts of the country and Canada. And during those times, we would all come together and do our outreaches together. And so there were about 500 of us that were planning on going down to Mexico City to do a major outreach there. But we needed a stopover place before we went over into Mexico. And so I was asked to kind of organize for that. So I knew a lady by the name of Virginia Turner, who was the city editor of the El Paso Herald-Post. And she said, well, you ought to get in touch with Father Thomas. He might be able to help you. And says, I serve on his board. And so I met Father Thomas. I went to the Our Lady's Youth Center and walked into the lobby there. And they said, well, after a few minutes, he said, well, he'll see you. So I walked into his office, and there he was, sitting behind a desk that probably was not much larger than this table here, just a small desk piled high with papers. And there was his Labrador Retriever, his black Labrador Retriever, Ginger. It was sitting right by his side. Okay. And he said, come on in. And he said, what can I do for you? And I sat down and I said, we've got 500 people coming in here in a couple of months. Can you help us to house them? He said, well, wait just a minute. So he sat there and he closed his eyes and he began to pray. And there I was watching him pray. And after about 2 or 3 minutes, he opens his eyes, he looks at me and he said, "Yep, I can help you."
He was checking with the Father first, huh?
He was checking with the Lord, and that's what he did. You know, that was his thing. More than anybody that I think that I've ever known, he listened to what the Lord wanted him to do.
He was kind of a radical personality. He wasn't your stereotypical Christian type person, right?
He really was. You know, there was a period of time in which he was very much involved in the pro-life movement, and he actually, you know, there was a protest that was taking place on the sidewalks of a particular abortion clinic here in town, and Father Thomas, along with others, blocked the entrance of the abortion clinic with their bodies, and he was arrested and put into jail. And I hear this wonderful, godly man that was helping so many people, and here he is in jail. And they said, "Well, all you have to do is pay a small amount, your bond, and you'll be out in no time at all." He said, "I'm not paying anything." They took the bond down to $1. He said, "Just pay $1 and you can get out." He says, "I'm not paying one dime because I don't belong in. I shouldn't be here." So they didn't know how to handle that, and of course the uproar in the community about it all, and so they let him out.
They let him out.
But he, not before he was able to make a strong statement about something that is so very important.
Now let's go to one more video clip, which talks about some of the outgrowth of this incredible miracle.
When we first started coming here, almost all of them lived in cardboard shacks. They'd make enough to maybe eat groceries, store-bought groceries, for 3 days of the week. And the rest of the week, they literally eat garbage.
Every day was the same. They had to work 7 days a week to make $5. You know, every day, all day, 7 days a week, no holiday, no Sunday, nothing. They wouldn't know what going to church is. So in order to tell them about Jesus, we had to go out and work in the garbage with them. And I could see that this was a great grace of God in the hearts of these people who came from middle-class homes and had air conditioning, and they'd get out there with millions of flies and the garbage and the stench. And
it smelled bad, and the people were very dirty, and there were a lot of flies, and it was not a very nice place to work, actually. But he healed us so much that we later, working with them, didn't even smell all the trash.
And then, of course, many other things happened since then that have come through prayer and studying the Bible. And I mean, there's so many wonderful things that we see God do every day. And there's a big body of people that have been reformed by God, and it's the Holy Spirit at work. That's all there is to it, and it's beautiful. I really enjoy life now. I'm not bored, I'm not worried, and I have a lot of fun.
You know, it's very easy for us to think, oh, well, Father Rick's a priest, and that drawl that he has and that dry humor that he expresses, you know, that's because he's a priest. He's supposed to be holy. Well, we all know that priests are human beings, just like all the rest of us. And we thank God for touching Father Rick's life. We thank the Lord for manifesting himself there with Father Rick. And through the manifestation of the Holy Spirit in Father Rick's life, a whole section of the Lord's vineyard has been changed for the good.
The book Miracle in El Paso was actually written by Father Rene, I think it's Laurentin, who investigated miracles at Lourdes and other places. He's actually a professional miracle investigator, and he certified that this was indeed true miracles that happened, not only the multiplication, but also healings and many, many lives transformed and so forth. So what should we take away from this story in remembering it here 40 years later?
I think the first thing would be just the sure and certain knowledge that God is close at hand. You know, He is not way off somewhere in the universe and not aware of the things that we go through in this life, which oftentimes are difficult. And so the Lord is close at hand. And along with that, He's close at hand to speak to our hearts and to give us guidance and direction. That's what Father Thomas and his community did. They more than anything else tried to listen to the Lord. You know, no one is perfect in terms of being able to hear the Lord correctly all the time. We're all learning. As Christians, we're learning how to listen and how to then the grace to obey. But that was, I think, a marvelous example of people who were listening to the Lord and then willing to obey what He said. And the result of that was all of this great ministry that took place to so many thousands of people. And then certainly the third thing would be God's heart for the poor.
Right. Yeah.
And when we minister to the poor, when we help the poor, then we are helping the Lord in a real sense, because He fully identifies with who they are and what they're going through.
And He wants us to be, and it's our privilege to be part of that.
It really is.
It really is. What are the things that you know, we think, oh, all these marvelous things happened, but the prayer group that was the genesis of this, and then the work that they did afterwards, it really wasn't that much different than many other prayer groups which meet and pray, and people who do a lot of work for on the Lord's behalf for many other people. So there wasn't, was there an extraordinary sense of something happening with this situation compared to other prayer groups that some of our viewers might be involved in, or we might be involved in? Was there something extraordinary about this?
Well, I don't know that there was anything real extraordinary other than, you know, the people that prayed with Father Thomas, they were also willing to do. It wasn't just prayer, as important as that was. That's where they got their directions. But they were then committed to carry out what the Lord was instructing them to do.
Right. And then we have Easter upon us here. What can we reflect on this Easter season based on what we've talked about today?
Well, the Lord is risen, and His resurrected presence is with us to lead us and to guide us and to help us in the ministries that He calls all of us as His people to do.
And it's no different than what happened at that dump in Juarez on Christmas Day, is it?
Wherever you live, whatever God calls you to do,
right,
to bring the resurrected presence of Jesus to the lives of those that you have contact with.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Bill.
You're sure welcome.
Has learning about this miracle affected you? Please let us know on the social media, and thank you for watching.